Good morning and welcome. This is Using Data for More Inclusive Public Engagement, a lunch and learn hosted for the Institute for Local Government, or ILG, and our partner, Social Pinpoint. Next slide, please. My name is Hannah Stelmakovich. I'm the program manager at the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator for this lunch and learn. Just a few housekeeping and tech overview items before we begin. All webinar participants will be on mute for the duration of this event. Please use the Q&A box and drop your questions as we go with our presentations. I would like to thank everyone who submitted questions upon registration. Our speakers reviewed the questions. We definitely tried to address a lot of them related to data throughout the presentation, so you will hear the answers here and there. There was a lot of questions about outreach strategies and how to reach and engage folks who don't traditionally participate, questions about stipends and language access. Those are very important topics. They are not going to be the focus of our webinar today. However, we're going to share some of the resources which will provide some of the answers and strategies to those questions. And folks at ILG, me and my colleague Roberto, we are here for you. We're here to help. Just email us. We'll chat with you. We'll point you to the right direction, to the right resources about those outreach and engagement strategies for underserved communities. There's also a chat function on your screen. We encourage you to use it to let us know about any logistical challenges and technical issues. For the chat function and for the Q&A box, just drop your questions as we go. We'll try to answer a few of them after each presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. Next slide, please.
And also just a reminder that it will be recorded.
Thank you. Yes, it will be recorded and posted, and you will receive the notification. The PowerPoints will be available as well. All right, this is our agenda for today. We're going to do quick introductions about ILG, Institute for Local Government. We're going to set a stage. What do we mean by data, why data is important, and how data can inform the development and implementation of public engagement approaches and outreach strategies that are really centered around equity. We're going to hear from City of Sunnyvale. They have a fantastic example about their redistricting and how public engagement has informed their process and ensured that the outcomes, data collected and outcomes are equitable and representative of socioeconomic landscape of their community. And we're going to hear from our friends at Social Pinpoint. Social Pinpoint folks have been working around the nation with various jurisdictions. They also have a lot of lessons learned and tips and tricks to share, as well as the tools about data-driven engagement. How do we collect, why it's important, how we analyze, what story does the data tell us. And then we're going to have our Q&A.
We'll also have some time in between the presentations to grab one or two questions along the way as well.
And this is me. Hello, we can go to the next slide. For those of you who are not very familiar with the Institute for Local Government, we are a nonprofit organization. We're a training and education affiliate of 3 statewide local government associations: League of California Cities, California Special District Association, and California State Association of Counties. Together with our affiliates, we serve more than 2,500 agencies, cities, counties, and special districts. What do? We have 4 different program areas. We have workforce development program area, leadership and governance, sustainable and resilient communities, and public engagement. In public engagement program or pillar, we are moving the needle and working with the local agencies to help them to develop and implement public engagement approaches, outreach strategies that are centered around equity, that are inclusive, and they're very intentional. We develop resources, we do education and training, we provide technical assistance to build some capacities for local governments, we do convenience. At the end of the day, we're here to help local governments to navigate complexities, to increase their capacity, and to build trust in their communities. So with that, let me introduce the speakers. Today, we're going to hear from my colleague, a senior program manager at the Institute for Local Government, Roberta Carlos Torres, Jackie Guzman with the City of Sunnyvale. She's a deputy city manager, is here. Thank you for being here, Jackie. And we have our social pinpoint folks, David Trakas, he's a manager of revenue operations, and Sophia Robinson, account executive and head of planning practice. And with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Roberta.
Thank you, Hannah, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this really important topic. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Roberto Carlos Torres. My pronouns are he, him, él, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at the Institute for Local Government, overseeing our public engagement and equity work. Prior to working for ILG, I was the climate equity specialist at the City of San Diego, where I helped develop the first of its kind climate equity index, as well as revolutionize community engagement at the city to be more equitable through data. So very topical conversation today, and very happy to share my experience as well as the experience from the rest of the presenters today. But so for today, really wanting to set the stage on what we mean when we're talking about equitable engagement, what that looks like, and really how data is a very powerful tool that can really help ensure equity is built into the conversation and programs that you are looking to institute on at your local government agency. And so really wanting to first start out with the conversation of what is equity and how does that differ from equality? Because oftentimes we really hear equity being used interchangeably with equality, and there are very different things. If you look at the image here on the left of your screen, you see that equality really is about providing the same resource to everyone regardless of their need or situation, right? Equity really talks about giving everyone the resources that they need, that understands and is responsive to any barriers or circumstances and conditions that they have, right? This illustration shows you that example with a bicycle or mobility device. But when we're talking about equitable engagement, what that really looks like is being able to address the barriers and conditions that sometimes make certain demographics or communities not so engaged, right? We have our usual folks that will always participate and always be at the table. And then we have some who have a harder time. That can be because of financial barriers, barriers to attending a meeting or participating because of language barriers and things of that nature, right? So when we're talking about equitable engagement, we're looking to really shift the paradigm and ensure that we are hearing from the representative body of the community and doing so by meeting the needs of the communities to participate and engage with us. So as we're going on this equitable journey, there's a couple things to note, right? First, the importance of just recognizing equity, right? There are historical inequities that persist and continue to perpetuate circumstances today. And so being able to understand what those inequities are and how they're impacting the world today is really important. And when we're seeking to advance equity, it requires intentional action. There needs to be specific thought given to how we're going to engage equitably and what are the actions that we have to take to do so. And the great part of this is that equity can be achieved through authentic engagement, ensuring that we are hearing from all communities and that we're doing our best to really uplift the voices that historically are left out of the decision-making table. Sometimes, however, when folks hear that, it almost begs the question of, well, how do we ensure that we're hearing from everyone and that we're not picking favorites, right? Well, when we're addressing equity, we need to understand that for engagement, this is not a zero-sum game. The more people that engage, the more voices that you hear, the better it is overall for the community. And our perspective is really to ensure that we're uplifting the voices that are rarely heard in the decision-making process. And so when we talk about prioritizing these communities, it's not about dismissing or ignoring other voices. It's ensuring that those voices are at the table as well as bringing others forward. So an important note when we're talking about equity in this process. Also, just want to quickly talk about what we mean by engagement, because oftentimes we hear the word engagement, but we're really talking about different things, right? There's civic engagement, which is people voting, going out and letting their voices be heard. There's also outreach, which is the most common form of engagement that is confused sometimes, right? Outreach or sharing public information is really a one-way form of communicating from local government agencies out to the community, letting them know what's going on, what policies are being put forward and whatnot, right? It's similar to advertising and marketing, where it's one-way form of communication, but on the marketing side, it's really about promotion and letting folks know the good that's going on in your agencies, because that's also important. But when we talk about public engagement, what we're really talking about is a broad range of methods to gather information from the community, right? It's informing them about the decisions that are being made and the programs that are being developed, but it's also providing an opportunity for that community to shape it so that it's done in a way that is responsive to their needs and priorities, right? Going back to that equity, we need to know what the barriers and circumstances are to be able to address those needs and concerns in the community and design our programs and services in a way that's responsive to the diverse community, right? And so what we've seen throughout this is that data can be really integral in really ensuring we have that authentic engagement. It helps us understand how we're being representative, that we're reaching out to the broad diverse group of community members. And there are two types of data that really help get to this, right? There's quantitative data that is represented numerically, something that really you can put a number to and gives you statistics, if you will. And so we see those sources come from things like the US Census, but it can also be jurisdictional data, right? The number of building permits or utility rebates that are offered through your agency, or the street conditions that you have. This can also be external data updated by other organizations. External data such as a quality of life index or the healthy communities index, right? These are ones that typically grab census data, but also grab other forms of information from the Department of Public Health and whatnot to really come up with a numeric number to represent what's the quality of life in communities, right? You also can get that data through scientific surveys, right? Those that typically grab random samplings or unbiased design, really to just get an understanding of conditions on the ground and the statistics there. Aside from quantitative data that, if you think about, is about the numbers and the quantity of data points that you can grab, there's also qualitative data, right? And this is data that represents a concept or information on the ground. And the way that we get the qualitative information is usually through responses to a survey that are open-ended, understanding key themes or highlights from a meeting, as well as feedback or testimonials from how someone feels around the data or whatnot. So if you think of it, you can understand quantitative data as really being that numeric value, versus the qualitative data really gives you that anecdotal information to help add context to what the data is providing. And data can be a very valuable tool in ensuring that our engagement is equitable and effective, right? The benefits of using data in engagement is that it allows for us to easily visualize where there might be gaps or missing information, right? Or where attention is needed. It can also help provide justification, right? Oftentimes our local governments might want to prioritize a community over another. And of course, the community that's not being prioritized will ask the question, excuse me, why is our community not being prioritized? being able to provide the data to show, well, look, it's showing that XYZ community is facing a lot worse impacts than another, really can help provide that justification for decision makers, as well as for community conversations, to better understand why, when we have limited resources and we need to prioritize projects and programs, why the decisions are made the way they are. I will also say, though, that there are limits to what data can do, right? And some things of caution. The first is that really the data can tend to be used to overgeneralize, right? It doesn't always give you the whole or holistic picture of what's going on the ground. And it oftentimes will lack an emotional connection or component to what the information is telling us, right? And this is where really thinking through why you need qualitative and quantitative data to come in and provide a full picture and understand best what's going on the ground, how the community feels and how they're impacted, and then what you can do to better the program and service. So how do you use the data, right? You're able to use it for several different ways, right? First is just to help guide your planning process. When you're thinking of how you're going to engage communities and you're thinking of who you're going to talk to, that can really, the data can really help share what are the communities that need to be reached out to, right? So it helps really and guide your planning. It also can help you understand the current conditions on the ground and if there are any service gaps, right? However, you want to use that data really to take to the community and then verify it, right? Do some ground truthing with the community to ensure, does this make sense? Is this consistent with what you're feeling on a day-to-day basis, right? So always being able to take data, the qualitative piece of it, and then gather the quantitative is super important. And you're able to use the data to really evaluate your process from beginning to end. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is an example of how you can use data and engagement and the data cycle, right? Data is certainly something that you can use to inform your engagement. And you start off by first gathering that data. If it's data that you just don't have in your agency, you can use census data as a start, right? But you can also work with other departments or agency staff members to better know what data is currently available that you can use to understand the community demographics, to understand street conditions, things of that nature that fit for your project, right? Then you want to take the data that's been gathered and really engage with your stakeholders to do that ground truthing, to better understand what is resonating with that data and what's missing, right? Identify those gaps, do that ground truthing, and then be able to use the data to evaluate it. And it's a cycle that changes and doesn't necessarily start off with gathering the data. At times you might be actually engaging with a stakeholder and then going back to gathering the data. Similarly, after you evaluate something, you notice, hey, we actually have a gap missing. You do that cycle again, and it's iterative and can change depending on the style. But being able to start off with data and understanding the conditions is really important to get you on a good start. And I think the city of Sunnyvale does a great example of this, so I won't steal their thunder for that. But I know in the city of San Diego, as we were putting a data tool together, it was really important to bring the community into the development of that tool very early on to ensure that we could identify any gaps in the data, as well as ensure that the data that was being represented was the sentiment in the communities represented. So we often get talked a lot about, how do you use data when you have very limited resources? Sometimes it could just be one staff member responsible for doing the entire project, from engagement to gathering the data, right? Well, like I said, there are some ways to leverage data with those limited resources. The first is really any open data that's available, such as the US Census data, can really help you better understand just what are the demographics in your community. Being able to also survey and ask participants about their demographic data so that you know it's representative of the engagement can be a good tool. And you can do that through either online surveys or paper surveys that you have during your public engagement events, right? As folks are signing up for Zoom meetings, you can have them fill out some information on what they identify as demographically. Or if you're doing an in-person event, having a check-in that also just asks real quickly, how do you identify in your community? These are some really easy, low-hanging fruit methods to collect the data. You can also use existing platforms such as Microsoft Excel to organize your data collection points. And also just look at who's around you, right? Work with community organizations to understand the data that's available, as well as within your agency, who has the expertise to really help hone in on the data collection to help inform and evaluate your engagement work. So that was a lot, but I see Hannah's on, so I will stop there, open it up to any questions that you might have, and then I know our other speakers will really talk about the on-the-ground examples of what I was talking about.
Great. Thank you, Roberta, for getting us oriented around some of these concepts. A few quick clarifying questions from our audience. What is ground truthing? And if you have the examples of Microsoft extensions handy, feel free to share it now, or we can follow up with that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So ground truthing is really just verifying with the community what the data is telling you. So for example, in San Diego, there's a census tract that the city uses to better understand disadvantaged versus non-disadvantaged community. However, that census tract grabs two separate communities and lumps them into one. So the data tells us that this community, it's Mission Hills, is a very affluent community compared to the Midway district, which actually has more working class families, right? They're in one census tract. And so the census tract data tells us that is a disadvantaged community. However, ground truthing is taking that information, going into the community and saying, hey, do you consider yourself disadvantaged? And residents who live in the Mission Hills area would tell you, no, we're doing just fine. The average household income there is over $100,000 a year, versus in the Midway district, the average income is closer to $87,000 a year, right? So being able to take what the data tells you and then taking it to the community and verifying it, that's the process of ground truthing. And then in terms of the Microsoft extensions, they have things like Microsoft Form, I believe is what it's called. It's something that you can use to quickly survey folks, as well as simply just collecting the data and then dropping it into an Excel document, or something like Google Sheets if you don't have access to Microsoft. These are tools that can really just help you organize the data so that you can later analyze it and present it in a more digestible manner.
Thank you for that. All right. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We're gonna keep going, and we're gonna hear from Jackie Guzman. Jackie, please go ahead and share your screen. And I do see other questions from our audience. We will queue them up for the later.
Roberto, if you can stop sharing. There we go. Okay. All right. Thank you. I feel honored to have been asked to highlight some of the work that we did here in Sunnyvale using an inclusive public engagement process. Specifically, I'll be talking about our move to district-based elections in Sunnyvale. We were an at-large city where all of our council members were elected by every member of our community. And it was not reflective of the community's demographics. And so I'll go over a little bit about the project, our outreach plan, demographic data that we collected, and then our results. So just a little background on the project. The city began exploring a move to district-based elections back in 2018, before we received a notice from a local nonprofit, the Asian Law Alliance, warning us of a potential violation of the California Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act really is meant to protect racial minorities and ensure that they can elect candidates of their choice. And the remedy for a CVRA violation is moving to district-based elections. So the city, once we received the potential plaintiff letter, committed to placing a measure on the ballot, but only after doing extensive community outreach. We had lots of questions about what election we would put the ballot in, if we would do it in 2020 or 2022, and we would have a directly elected mayor or not. Lots of different questions we needed to get community input on. So when we initially started, we knew we had a couple of key data sources. The first one was the census, but we had to rely on the 2010 census when we first did our initial districting, because we started doing it before the 2020 census came out. What was interesting is we ended up going to district-based elections, and then just 2 years later, we had to do redistricting. So we had to do this process twice because of that census change. But that gave us point-in-time demographics, especially because districting and redistricting relies on precise population counts. And the goal is to have each district have population equality. So that was specifically had to be based on the census. But the census was old. I mean, we were doing this in 2019. And so we needed more up-to-date information on racial demographics, and other demographic information. So we relied on the American Community Survey, the ACS. And specifically, when we were targeting likely voters for our ballot measure, we were looking at the citizen voting age population data. So in terms of target audience, we needed to engage all of our Sunnyvale voters and potential voters for our ballot measure. But we also just needed to engage general Sunnyvale residents about population equality and ensuring that we were capturing communities of interest and not breaking up communities into different districts. Our council was really interested in ensuring that participation, that we engage people that generally don't engage in city business, and with a special emphasis on engaging racial and ethnic minorities. We have a large Asian population, we have a Latino population and a relatively small Black population, but we wanted to make sure that we were very mindful of engaging these communities. Just a flavor of our demographics here in the city. This is our citizen voting age population. And so I do have to say that our non-Hispanic white population is overrepresented in terms of voters compared to our general population. And so we were mindful that these were two different demographics. The voting age population, we relied on the ACS versus the general census data for our general population. One thing that Roberto talked about in terms of demographic survey, because we knew who we wanted to engage, we also had to keep track of, are we doing a good job of actually engaging them? So whenever we went out, whether it was in person or virtual, we did have a demographic survey. So we had generally census-based categories for age, race, ethnicity, household income, geographic area within the city, and housing tenure, which is, do they live in an apartment versus a single family home versus a mobile home, which we have quite a few mobile home parks here in Sunnyvale. So that was really important. We wanted to make sure we were representative of these different demographics in our engagement. And the only way to do that is to ask and to track the data. When we were thinking about how to be inclusive in our engagement, the first thing we did was a stakeholder mapping, which is really understanding who your stakeholders are in the community, who your formal and informal leaders are in the community, what nonprofits are operating in the community, what demographics do they serve, are there any groups in the city that you could engage? For us, we were looking at parent groups, nonprofit partners, even civic organizations like Rotary or the Elks, neighborhood associations, but also tracking what are places where people gather. And so we looked at places of worship. Our mobile home parks are pretty strong communities. And then generally, like our community center, library, farmers market, any place where folks were gathering, and specifically even festivals and special events that were happening. We did look at ethnic media, which ended up not being a super great source for us because it was more regional than specific to our city. We were mindful of translation and interpretation, and specifically when we're having meetings, we needed to make sure we had childcare and food to make it more accessible for people to participate. I'll just wanted to highlight language access. We wanted to root the languages that we provided based on data. So we went back to the ACS. The American Community Survey does have a report on limited English households. So while in the city of Sunnyvale, we have a very large Asian population, specifically Chinese and South Asian, we found that those communities were not limited English households. We're here in Silicon Valley, we have lots of tech workers. While they speak other languages at home, they also have a good command of the English language. So that was actually not a need, and we needed to dig into the data to find that out. Another really good source of data that's more specific to neighborhoods is the California Department of Education has a report on language groups by school. So you can get it even at the school level. And they have, they require that if at least 15% of a student population has a language need, then the school is required to provide translation. And we were able to tap into that data to know specifically in a specific area if there was going to be a language need or not in that area based on this school level data. One of the biggest things that we did to really engage communities that don't tend to come to us is through pop-up events. And so it was a really successful strategy. Again, instead of expecting people to come to us to a community meeting, we went to them. We set up booths at farmers market, outside of churches, in front of the library. We also did a lot of community meetings. So I personally went to different parent groups and presented there and gathered information. And so different ways to just go out to the community. All right, we also did a citizens advisory committee. So we had 9 residents that were representative of geographic, ethnic, and social diversity in the city, advising us on our outreach efforts. And so we would bring the data from the demographic surveys and show them this is how we're doing. We had 3 different phases to our project. And so we'd have touch points and say, this is how we're doing. We're actually having a hard time reaching the Latino population. How, strategize around how might we pivot our strategies and engage that community more so that we're meeting our targets. And so this was really helpful to have that dynamic conversation around our strategies and how effective they were. When we had our council appoint these folks, we also used demographic data and questions even in the application process so that we could recruit people that were diverse demographically on different aspects, social, socioeconomic, and race ethnicity. So it was a really helpful group, and they were ambassadors in our process. This is just a flavor of, I want to give you a specific example of just one phase, the first phase of participation. So we did do some open houses and workshops. We did pop-up events. We did presentations at community organizations and online engagement. And you can see here that our pop-up events by far were our most successful at engaging people, and also most successful at engaging our hard to reach populations. And so you can see this is the type of data that we would present to at our advisory committee around how we were doing in terms of reaching demographics. And so we were in our first phase. By the end of it, we did pretty well at engaging our tracking our demographics to our participation based on race and ethnicity. So you can see that there. You can see it based on household income. And while, you know, we could have done better in certain areas, we tracked pretty well. And then place of residence. This is the place where we realized we did a lot of outreach, especially in the north part of our community, which tends to be the lower income, more ethnically diverse part of the community. And so we put a lot of emphasis on there, which we did great. Our south part of our city tends to be the folks that generally engage, higher resource and educated population. And we realized maybe we had neglected the middle portion of our community. And so that's a pivot that we did for phase 2 of our project. The other thing that we realized is that I thought that our outreach consultants were using age categories that matched our census, and it turns out they did not do that. And so it was, they were using different categories. So when we tried to match it up, it didn't quite work. And so this is how we had to present the data. And we learned again in that second phase, we have to make sure, even if we collapse the categories, that they have to match with our census data so that we can provide that comparison. We also realized we're not doing so well with our younger demographics, and that's always a big challenge. All right. The other strategy that we use is really empower the community by giving them data. So part of this exercise around districting or redistricting is playing around with data to reach that population equality, but also making sure that you are creating opportunities for large racial and ethnic minorities to be able to have a voting power to elect council members of their choice. And so we provided that data to our community, and we said, hey, you know the community better than any demographic consultant, better than our outreach consultants, even sometimes better than staff. And so we want you to empower you to use data to be able to propose draft maps. And we provided training. Of course, we provided this really neat online tool, but if people were not comfortable with technology, they could do it on paper, they could do it on Excel, whatever way they felt comfortable. And we guided them through that process and really empowered them to do that. We actually did end up selecting a community drawn map, which was great. We didn't use one of the demographer maps, and the group that got together and put this map, they called themselves the Unity Group, and it was made up of a diverse group of Sunnyvale residents. We placed a measure on the ballot. It passed with 62% of the vote. And I'll end by just sharing some lessons learned. It's really important to invest in that stakeholder mapping so you know who is in your community, who you can reach out to and engage, and where and how, understanding those informal leaders. So we have, and it's not high tech for us, we have this huge Excel sheet where we break up our stakeholders into different categories. These are our religious groups in the city. These are our civic organizations. These are our nonprofits. These are our neighborhood leaders. These are our, other informal leaders in the community or formal leaders. And we track that data. We developed it during this process, but because we invested in it and have continued to keep it up, right, low tech, but it's been super helpful in other engagement processes to be able to tap into that information. Provide many different ways to engage with their community. Don't always expect them to come to you. You can go to them and go to where people are at. Track your outreach demographics so you know if you are successfully targeting and reaching the folks that you need to reach to make sure that your engagement is representative of your community. Conduct those dynamic check-ins to evaluate the effectiveness of your engagement strategies. And if they're not working, then pivot and do something different to see if you can better reach those hard to reach populations. And then again, for us, we always think about trying to do people-centered design with opportunities for co-creation with our communities, because if they feel like they are part of developing solutions, they're more likely to engage and feel like we're not just talking at them, but what their input and feedback they're giving to us is really making a difference. So again, we began transitioning to district-based elections in November 2020. We had a directly elected mayor and 3 council members elected in 2020 using the new district maps. And then in 2022, the remaining 3 at-large council members also became district-based. So we fully transitioned in 2022. And I just want to visually give you a picture of what our council looked like in 2018. Again, we're a very diverse community, and we had 1 person of color and 1 woman on our council at the time that we started this work. This is what our council looks like now. Majority people of color and 2 women on our council. So we're very proud that not only we did a good job with our outreach, but that the impact that this districting and redistricting process had on representation in our city has been really successful. And with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Fantastic presentation. I see the questions are coming in. In the interest of time, we would love to keep us moving with Bill and Sophia, sharing about their data-driven engagements. And Jackie, if you can answer those questions via chat and Q&A box, that would be great. Thank you for having these questions coming. All right, Sophia, Bill, take it away.
So, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to join us during the day of ILG, and thank you to Jackie for it's really interesting seeing all the insights and all the great work that you guys are doing over at the city of Sunnyvale. So my name is Billy Tracus. I'm the revenue operations manager here at Social Pinpoint. I have 6 years experience in the digital engagement space. So really kind of excited today to dive into some of the data-driven decision-making strategies, and then also hand it over to my partner, Sophia Robinson, to dive into our platform a little bit of a centralized place where you can have all your data. So Sophia, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Robeson. I'm the head of practice at Social Pinpoint. Previously, I worked in local government in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, doing community development and economic development work. And specifically, when I was working in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, spent a lot of time on creating the public engagement strategy for the municipality. And that's where I kind of got this sort of bit this bug in public engagement. So I'll toss it back to Billy to start with his slides.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so first, let's just start the stage up the role of data in public engagement. So as I'm here today to talk about, the important shift in the landscape of what's happening in local government. So as the National League of Cities report highlights, 78% of municipalities are prioritizing digital transformation for data-driven decision-making, right? Which is not really a trend, but also just a pivotal shift on how we approach our community engagement projects and the thought process through that. In 2022, the GovTech research found that 65% of local governments use data analytics in their decision-making processes. So that's kind of why it explains why we're all here today. So we can go to the next slide. So as we're thinking of an approach of how we can incorporate data into our public engagement projects, into our strategies, let's delve into a voice framework. I love a good acronym. So it's like a systematic approach to enhance the public engagement through data. So we've seen some examples of this already. So visualize, right? What does it mean setting specific public engagement objectives? Oh, organize. So this kind of refers to Jackie's example of knowing who to engage for that district mapping exercising, the stakeholder mapping exercise that they do, really understanding who within their community are they trying to engage and how they can uplift those voices. Integrate. So it's about merging various data sources. So as you're doing a community engagement exercise, right, through different projects, you're gonna have multiple different sources of how you're gathering that information. So how do you centralize that? How do you understand it? How do you create that? Communicate, which is a really important step here. 60% of residents feel more engaged when data is openly shared by the Civic Engagement Survey in 2021. So I really love Roberta's example on what they did with the city of San Diego, right? Bringing the community during the process to find any gaps, right? Taking that people-centric approach and making sure that you're sharing those insights along the way and helping form that strategy. And then finally, evaluate. So always assessing and adjusting your strategies based on the metrics and the data that you're collecting, right? Building upon each project, which will make it easier to engage and hopefully communicate your projects in the future. Next slide, please. So about this, the methods of data collection, right? There's going to be, of course, even more methods than just these, but just wanted to give, a quick example as far as, of the backbone approach of this data collection. So focus groups, they have a proven effect of creating deep insights, getting a deeper understanding. Community meetings, we always do that, but they've led to 25% increase in trust, according to public admin review. Online engagement. So this is preferred by the peer research. 70% of younger residents like to use a online platform, right? Just use that, having everything on their phones, being able to engage in the digital and new age. And then surveys, very quick, very easy to get that analytical information in and get that information and data in there. And so if we switch to the fourth slide about streamlining your public engagement. So using a diverse use of tools, mix of digital, but also in-person and print tools is essential. So you want to have multiple different ways so you can capture your diverse audiences with diverse tools. A centralized data system is key as well. So as you're collecting all those different types of data from whether it's focus groups, whether it's those surveys, the online platforms, right? You have that channel where you can ensure the efficiencies of your engagement strategies. So hopefully then you can automate some of those feedback collections. You could also automate some of those communications back. Hey, thank you for taking part of our survey. This is what we've learned, right? So making sure that the public is involved throughout the whole process. And so really want to key in on the next slide is that centralizing that data strategy. And this is kind of where Social Pinpoint and other online platforms kind of come in, as far as when you have a centralized place for your data, it can't really be overstated. So aggregating that data over time is crucial for the decision-making processes. So I've been throwing out a lot of stats here, so I got one last stat before I throw it over to Sophia. But Urban Institute study reports that centralized systems lead to 35% more efficiency into the decision-making process. So having a data-centered approach is not only effective, but efficient. So you want to become agile over time, but making sure all those the data that you're collecting, you can use for reference later, but then you can also build upon it when you have a centralized data place for your data. And now I'll hand it over to Sophia to take it away there.
Thanks, Billy. So the next piece that I'm going to talk about is how you can use an online system like Social Pinpoint to track your data. I do want to note that, like Jackie, for instance, referenced that they're using this huge Excel document. And what I've tried to do here is to emphasize the pieces that are going to be consistent across the type of platform that you might be using, whether that's an Excel document or a more robust system like this. And using maybe a system that's designed for this, that if you have the capacity and resources for that. That's a way that you can support your staff, but you can absolutely apply a lot of these lessons learned based on all the different sort of levels of resource that you might have. So with that being said, what's really nice about having a centralized location for keeping track of your data, again, whether that's a system like Social Pinpoint or a different digital engagement platform, or a simple Excel spreadsheet, right? This is going to provide you with a single source of truth for all of your engagements. Depending on the level of sort of data that you're collecting, we see a lot of our clients end up having, each individual department or even each individual project has a separate database that they're using. And so finding ways to bring those together can help to have individual projects that aren't asking the same questions in multiple ways. And again, helping you to do things like prevent engagement fatigue. The other thing that's really great about having an online resource that's going to be, again, your single source of truth is that it will allow you to build an online community of repeat engagers. And this is a really big thing that we talk about with our clients, that when you're doing your traditional in-person meeting, we all kind of know who our usual suspects might be. Your online community is going to look different than your in-person community. And the way that your online community looks different is going to vary by your community. So smaller communities, for example, often see actually a lot of older engagement online, whereas larger cities actually see a much larger engagement of younger communities online. Those, again, are huge generalizations. I think it was Roberto sort of talking at the beginning about generalizations. And so, but those are sort of some broad trends that we see across our clients. The other thing that you want to look for when you're creating a system for tracking lots of different engagements is you want to be able to look at your quantitative, qualitative, and spatial data and understand what you're going to be doing with that data. Using and then leveraging data as part of your decision-making and process creation is a huge lift for staff. It's a really big capacity sort of need. And we often find that people are coming to us and saying, hey, I have all this data. I've never used it. I don't know what to do with it. We all have sort of different data sources and we don't know how to get them to talk to each other. And so this is a really big effort. When you're creating a system like this, you want to spend a lot of time asking yourselves, what data do we need? How are we going to track it? And then what are we going to do with it once we have it? I just saw ahead of time, there were a lot of questions in particular about smaller and more rural communities. And so I wanted to provide this example from a small community that we work with in Wisconsin. And I've provided a bunch of links, and I know Hannah will share the PowerPoints afterwards. So feel free to sort of dive into that as you like. So why are we focusing on reporting towards inclusive engagement? A big piece of this is that you should only be asking questions of the public that you know you need the answers to. Sometimes we have a tendency to ask really broad questions because it's fun, but fun questions aren't always actually able to be used. I often use the example of, I did a lot of work with transportation planners, and there were sort of a lot of bike lane projects happening, and they would go into communities and say, do you want a bike lane? And often the community would say no. And then they would go in and they would add a bike lane, and that lost all the trust, right? And those engagement meetings were no fun. In doing a bit of an audit of that, we realized they were going to get a bike lane no matter what. And so the more honest and truthful question was instead to say, what do you want your bike lane to look like? And then you could kind of dive in. That also means then that with the question, the data you're getting, because it's what you actually need as you're moving forward in your implementation, is going to be usable. That sort of speaks to this next bullet about understanding what your contributors want. If you're sort of anticipating that conflict between something that you're doing that people are not going to respond positively to, being really honest about the realm of influence is going to be an important piece of this, and having data that's useful and actionable. Another thing you can do here is using your data to track your progress. I thought Jackie gave some great examples of this in identifying those gaps. And I had a couple other anecdotes in here around that as well. Understanding your target audiences and those sort of key audiences that are maybe regularly underrepresented, and giving yourself some regular intervals to check in and say, hey, we designed this engagement. what was the sort of demographic breakdown of our engagers, what were our goals for demographic representation, and how can we then go back and readjust our system. The other thing just to sort of note is that in whatever way you end up collecting your data, you really need to make sure that you're collecting it in a way that can be moved into other systems as you might need. And I'll talk about that more later. So now I'm going to talk about, there's sort of 3 different levels of data that you could be collecting. When you're looking at data across lots of different projects, we call these kind of your macro analytics, or if you're using a platform like Social Pinpoint, these would be your site-wide analytics. This is what's going to help you to understand what a visitor does when they come to your site. And I've highlighted here, we call these conversion rates, your feedback, attention, and actions. There's a little description on the screen of what each of those is. And this is what's going to, again, help you to understand what someone does when they come to the page. So are they an active engager or a passive engager? And oftentimes we're only looking at data around our active engagers. This is who actually left a comment in our sort of engagement or on our engagement page, whatever it is. But your passive engagers are also of great value. These might be folks who come to your site and they say, okay, cool, I got the content I needed, I'm good, I'm moving on. Those are going to be overwhelmingly more positive usually than your active engagers. And so how are you kind of capturing that data and leveraging that? That's a really difficult question to answer. I have included here, these percentages on the screen are averages across clients. Again, a massive generalization. It's going to vary quite a lot. We have noticed actually a downward trend across our clients. And we're sort of thinking from our interviews with clients that this has maybe contributed to some engagement fatigue. And I would love to dive into conversation with you all about your own perceptions of why that might be. A little bit more about some site-wide analytics. Some other things that you could be tracking, and this goes for in-person, hybrid, and online engagement, is your audience returning? Are you capturing people more than once? And are you capturing new engagers more than once? A sort of piece here I often note is if someone comes to contribute to a project about an individual dog park, how do you leverage that engager into then going and participating in a different recreation-based project or an environment-based project? You can also look at acquisition. So if you do have a marketing strategy or some communications efforts, maybe you've made your first attempt to invest in Facebook ads, for example, to get people to show up to a public meeting. How do you know if that Facebook ad is working, if that $15 you spent on the Facebook ad was a good investment? You want a system that's going to help you to sort of track that. Just for time, I'm going to skip over this next bullet, but the final bullet here is that the last thing that you really want to understand from a site-wide level is what are the different ways that you need to stratify your data. So we can obviously look at a per project basis, but you might also need to look at a departmental basis. You might want to look at a topic basis, and your topics and your departments might be different, right? With an environment example, for example, you might have your transportation department, your planning department, and your parks department all working on environment. So do you sort of look at those together? And those are pieces that as you're setting up your system, you want to be cognizant of. The next piece is looking at results of an individual engagement. Just for time, again, I'm going to kind of gloss over this a little bit, but this is where you're diving into the individual responses to questions. Some things that you want to be looking out for are you collecting IP addresses? And I have some opinions on IP addresses I'm happy to dive into if that's of interest. You want to make sure that each of your responses is including a unique identifier. This is really important so that when you move between different analytics systems, you're always able to really easily keep track of each line. I have included here a video. We got some questions ahead of time about what the back end of our system actually looks like for reporting. I didn't want to spend too much time in the webinar going through that because it's pretty detailed, but if you wanted to watch this later, that video is about 6 minutes long. And then the third tier of data that you could be looking at is your people analytics and your demographics. And I thought that Jackie did an awesome job actually of diving into kind of what the breakdown of this can look like. And she emphasized one of the pieces that I was going to talk about as well, which is around how you craft your demographic questions, and then what you're comparing them to. So we often recommend that you take a look at census questions and identify the census questions that sort of relate most strongly to the demographic areas that you're trying to track. And then to her point about, if you accidentally ask the same age question in 2 different ways, makes it very difficult to then do an apples to apples comparison. Example I always like to give there, though, however, is that there are some issues with the way that census questions are written. And so it is worth it to take some time as an organization to consider if you agree with the way that all these questions are asked. A common example I always give is that the race-based questions do not have a category for Middle East and North African. And so oftentimes these communities end up selecting white. And that's not actually going to help you to understand if you're reaching that community, if that's a large community in your study area. And so you may choose to add that. It's called MENA. There's a lot of online resources about how to sort of add that to your demographic questions. And that's a really common one where we see people deviate from the census to create better equitable outcomes. Again, for time, I'm going to skip over some of these pieces, but I'm happy to come back and talk about them later. The final thing I have here is just some best practices around creating a digital engagement system so that you have useful reports. The first piece here is that you really want to be crafting your engagements with an objective in mind. And we talked about this quite a bit earlier. So this is a big effort to identify your public's realm of influence. And I would say that's kind of the best place to start there. You always want to be thinking about how your page is going to be accessed by mobile or tablet users. A lot of our clients are looking at over 70% of their engagers participating from mobile devices. You want to consider what the digital experience is. Government employees, and I put myself in this category because I have been one, we put a ton of content on our sites and our handouts. For us, a lot of this content is regulatory required content to be on there. And we also think it's the coolest thing in the world, right? A lot of your participants either aren't going to have time to read all of that content, or they simply won't be interested. And so I really encourage you to think about how you can present your static or your flat content in more engaging ways, and think about letting people choose their own adventure. You can use a variety of different feedback tools as well. So in addition to sort of some of those actual contexts that have been discussed before, you might also think about different activity styles. So this might be open-ended questions, but it could also be really, targeted visual preference surveys or dropping pins on a map, etc. How are you combining these tools? And just a quick anecdote I'll give there that speaks to this next bullet as well. We had a client in Monterey, California that did a very cool project looking at a housing study, and they separated out their online engagement so that when people came to the site, the first question they were asked was, do you have 5 minutes or do you have 15 minutes? If you only had 5 minutes, it took you to one engagement activity that you could get in and out really fast. And if you had 15, it was a little bit more focused on educating the participant and then asking them for some more nuanced input. So again, and then they had really different demographic breakdowns across those two tools. So just a really cool strategy that I think emphasizes some of the text you'll see on the screen here. That's
Sophia, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. We're 5 minutes over time. If you can please just quickly wrap it up. Okay.
That's the end. That's my last slide. I'll pass it back to you, Hannah. Go for it.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing all this. I know we're 5 minutes over time. I apologize to our attendees. There's so much information we wanted to share. There's simply not enough time. I hope you had an opportunity to learn from our speakers about type of the data, how we can use it. There's a few more resources from the Institute for Local Government about inclusive engagement policies, resources to reach those folks who don't traditionally participate. I'm dropping the link for a community landscape resource that helps you to start doing the stakeholder analysis and figure out who else to include. And please email me or Roberto for those about these resources and questions that you have. We also offer a few trainings, meeting mastery, facilitation training, and public engagement training, where we do deep dives on how to design and implement and facilitate public workshops, and data is part of that as well. If you want to learn more, stay tuned for our upcoming trainings. Let's go. Recordings will be available. PowerPoints will be available. Stay tuned for that. You will receive notifications. And in our very last slide, all our contact information is on the slide for our speakers. If you can go to the next slide, Roberta, please reach out to Roberta or me. Please reach out to Jackie for any follow-up questions. Jackie, I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot. Bill and Sophia are available as well. You know, they're wealth of information and tips and resources. So please stay in touch. Please don't be a stranger. Please reach out to us. Again, thank you for joining us today and have the great rest of your day.